Hello, this is Dr. Harriet Fraad with Capitalism Hits Home. It's a show about the intersections of our whole bio, psycho, social, political, economic lives. Today, I'll be talking about the fall of the American empire, how it registers, how it shows itself since it's not widely acknowledged. But before I begin, I want to thank you for listening and tell you that Capitalism Hits Home is produced by Democracy at Work, a nonprofit, small donor organization. It's a media organization, and we're celebrating 10 years of bringing you critical analysis that you won't get elsewhere, hope, and visions of a more just and equitable world. Please help support our work. Go to www.democracyatwork.info and sign up for our email list. There you'll get a concise weekly roundup of new releases, merchandise and merchandise discounts, and messages from show hosts, and more. Also, even before we begin, I want to thank you. Thank you for listening. If you're a financial supporter, thank you so much. We depend on your support. And thank you to all people who listen and who share this program. In those ways, you partner with us, and I'm grateful. Today, I want to talk about, as I said, the fall of the American empire, which is happening around us, largely unacknowledged. Next time I do a podcast, I'll talk more about how we're coping with our unacknowledged reality, the fall of the American empire. We have been the richest and most dominant nation for 77 years, since the end of World War II. World War II demolished all possible competitors for economic dominance. We were the only economy left standing. Our biggest competitor now, the second richest and most powerful nation in the world, China, was completely demolished by the Japanese invasion, which killed millions of people, by famine, and by their own civil war after World War II. Russia was similarly demolished. Europe was demolished. We were the only economy left standing. All our productive capacities could work and produce the goods and services to supply the rest of the world. The dollar has been global currency, which is an emblem of our power. That's beginning to change with the fall of the American empire. So the Chinese yuan is becoming used. But we have always, since World War II, been the global currency of the world. Languages that are spoken in foreign countries, on planes and trains, are spoken in their native language and also in English, American English. Americans who were in families headed by a white male, which were a vast majority of families in 1946, could look forward to steady jobs with a steady flow of income at family wages, which is wages that could support a family. Unions fought hard to achieve those wages and those benefits that were there for families in America headed by white males. Now, of course, in a racist, sexist country, families headed by females didn't share those blessings, but they were a small minority, unlike now. And families headed by people of color were similarly not blessed by family wages. Also, the emotional support for Americans, stable marriages, were everywhere. In the early 50s up to the 70s, the United States had a divorce rate of 25% or less. We could look forward to ever longer lives. Americans were the tallest people in the world. There was a sense of safety here, not only because we had won World War II, but because our government was there for us if we were white and headed in families headed by a white male. Everyone could get a stable job, even though women and people of color did not get as good jobs. We could count on a stable job. Now, all of that has changed as our empire is falling, even though that fall is not acknowledged. Jobs are precarious now. There isn't the idea that you will have a steady job and then you will retire with a pension. Not at all. Millions of jobs have been outsourced to countries with lower wages. I'll talk about that later more. But the jobs that are there usually don't have union protection because union protection has gone way down. People are beginning to realize how much they need unions and fighting for them, but it went way down. And so people now can't count on a steady job with a steady income. There's also personal precarity. The majority of people get divorced or separated. 75% of US kids don't grow up with their original parents. That's something new. Even though the divorce rate is formally 50%, what is now increasingly common are informal divorces, where people don't want to spend the money to get legally divorced, and they don't have huge fights over money that they don't have or over custody of children, so they just split. That's another 15 to 20% of people, which means that the experienced divorce rate is more like 65 or 70% of marriages. For the first time in our history, the majority of American women are single, and single by choice. Children, as a rule, for the first time in our history, will earn less than their parents. I'm sure there's some exceptions, but statistically, children can look forward to a less prosperous future than their parents had. Americans' lives get shorter every year. People are dying younger. And what's very interesting and very sad is the biggest proportion of those dying are between 35 and 44 years old. Same thing happened after the Soviet Union fell in 1989. And those are usually people who would have previously looked forward to having an established and successful, decent life, and now don't. We're also getting shorter. We're no longer the tallest people in the world. So that there's every sign that something's wrong, that our ascendancy and our global dominance no longer exist. Children will look forward to earning less than their parents and being less secure both in their personal relationships and in their jobs. Also, America is a less egalitarian nation than ever before. In 1970, we were the most equal, the most egalitarian nation in the Western developed world. Now we are the least equal, the least egalitarian nation. In 1970, corporate CEOs made about 40 times what the average worker makes. Now it's above 300 times more. And so the disparities between those billionaires and the rest of us is stark, as most people lost during the recent pandemic. 20 billionaires increased their fortunes at our expense. Our society is falling apart. Americans don't feel safe anymore. They don't feel personally safe. They don't feel politically safe. They don't feel protected. America has had more COVID deaths than any other nation in the globe, even though we're hardly the most populous nation. China has had 35,000 deaths. We've had over 1,100,000 deaths. Crime and violence are increasing everywhere as people are going mad and as the gun lobby has trained men who are the perpetrators of this violence to feel that they can regain their power and their manhood through guns. There's more than one mass shooting every single day in the United States. And it's increasing. And by the way, a mass shooting is where 4 people get shot, not including the shooter, and where the mass shooter doesn't know these people and have a personal grudge, but is just killing people or trying to, or wounding people out of rage and upset. In 2018, there were 340 mass killings in the United States. In 2020, there have been 690 mass shootings. That's 2020 to 2021. Between 21 and 22, they haven't yet calculated. Until very recently, as the empire started to really tumble, basic processes of what we call our democracy went in orderly fashion. If people were defeated because they didn't get sufficient electoral or popular votes, they relinquished their offices gracefully and formally, helping the next leaders by showing them the ropes. Trump is the first president who refused that, who refused the results and insisted on denying the election results and organizing his followers to violently storm the Capitol in order to reclaim the election for Donald Trump. Kari Lake declined to recognize the results of the gubernatorial governor's election in Arizona. She had 3 lawsuits trying to get the election results disqualified and failed every one, whether the judges on those lawsuits were appointed by Democrats or, as was largely true, by Republicans. Men tried to violently kidnap the governor of Michigan. We also elected a president who was a sex molester, bragging about it, and who obviously cheated on his taxes since he paid nothing for many years, even though he was a rich man. And most recently, an elected congressman, George Santos, was elected in New York, and he hasn't been impeached or forced to resign by the Republican Party, even though his entire campaign was built on lies. The funding is questionable and being investigated. He lied about his religion. He lied about his experiences as a gay man. He lied about his history and his nationality. He lied about the district that he's from. He lied about his financial assets. He also lied about his history of fraud in Brazil. Wow. Everything was revealed by the New York Times as lies. But he insists that he can govern, and the Republican Party has not repudiated him and forced him to resign. Our government now is not trusted with our health, to the extent that a lot of Americans won't take the COVID-19 vaccine, even though our government and the Centers for Disease Control have shown scientifically that it stops people from getting killed by COVID-19. Previously, the vaccinations our government has dispensed to protect us from disease have been uniformly accepted and taken, whether they're the vaccine against smallpox or measles or mumps or German measles or polio. Americans took those vaccinations very willingly because we overwhelmingly felt that our government protected us. No more. There are international signs that the empire is falling. The U.S. wanted a uniform condemnation and sanctions against Russia for invading Ukraine. When Biden called an African summit to get uniform support for condemning Russia, just a little under half of the countries in Africa refused to do that. They abstained from anything like that. 35 nations in the U.S. didn't join the U.S. in condemning Russia for invading Ukraine. And that's because the U.S. is no longer calling all the shots. Our empire is beginning to fall. When the U.S. called for a worldwide boycott of Russian oil and gas, the majority of the world's population, that is, the people in India and the people in China, refused. Instead, they are importing vast amounts of Russian national gas and oil and selling them at a higher price, contributing to the inflation. Only Europe went along with the United States, in spite of many demonstrations by its people. In another sign, the Saudis, who always obediently went along with the U.S., refused to increase oil production. When the U.S. asked that they increase oil production to get prices down, they basically told our government to pound sand, forget it. Even the U.S. oil and gas companies refused our government's request to lower their prices. And of course, the U.S. has its ample supplies of oil and gas. There was no reason to increase the prices except greed, and the U.S. oil and gas companies decided to join the foreign gas and oil companies and raise their prices and refused Biden. That's because they don't have to listen the way they used to. In 1971, then President Nixon called a price freeze because inflation was getting out of control. He called a wage and price freeze, and the penalty for disobeying was immediate imprisonment. The inflation stopped. The corporations listened to the government. The U.S. was at its height. It was capitalist greed that shaped this loss. How does that work? Why did the fall of the American empire have to do with capitalist greed? Well, the U.S. corporations decided in the late 70s that now that technology enabled them to export jobs, now that there were faxes and computers and fast jet travel, they could export their manufacturing to countries with low wages and no ecological protections and pensions and sick days. All those things that unionized American workers fought for, they could evade. China had the most disciplined workforce, and most of those jobs, millions of manufacturing jobs, went to China, whose wages are higher than the others at $3.19 an hour, but nonetheless far short of the over $30 that American workers fought for, and with no protection. So this was an enormous boon for the profits of greedy American companies. They then took the money, the billions they were acquiring, and came back and bought our government, since we have no limits on campaign spending, unlike the rest of Europe, Scandinavia, and other nations. We allowed campaign corporations to buy our government. Also, the US, unlike our European counterparts, did not have a strong enough socialist, communist, other left parties. The McCarthy era wiped them out. So they didn't create laws along with the unions to stop outsourcing. Those penalties exist across Europe and Scandinavia, but not in the United States. So Americans became immiserated. Manufacturing jobs were converted to service jobs, which were the jobs more given to women and therefore lower paid. Unions atrophied. The United States empire is falling. There's every sign. And what the United States is doing to counteract that can be seen in funding the war in Ukraine, because the war in Ukraine, according to Biden's own words, is created to exhaust Russia and to use NATO to exhaust Russia. Russia has the most natural resources in the world. China has the most people. China and Russia are now in an alliance. They are close allies in BRICS, which is an economic rival to the US influence in the economies of the BRICS countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, with 12 countries that want to enter BRICS and be part of it. So that one way the United States is trying to regain its dominance is to knock out Russia through the Ukraine, so that we become more dominant, and to use NATO for that purpose, and thus the war in Ukraine, to which the American government, with our passive okay, has allowed $100 billion to be given to that effort. I should say, because it's important to note, that $50 billion would inject every single person in the whole world with enough vaccinations to stop COVID. That's half of what we gave to the war in Ukraine, with Americans' passive acceptance and our Congress going along, with the exception of some very exceptional legislators like AOC. And so, to summarize, the empire is falling, and that affects all of us. It affects our level of danger. It affects our level of safety. It affects our level of belief in government. It affects our health. It affects us across the board. It affects us personally, as we are less secure and our families fall apart, and the security and belief we used to have in our government ends, or is eroded to the point where it's looking like it's ending. And the reason that I'm bringing this up is it's a ubiquitous, all over the place reality which is largely ignored. That's the end of today's podcast of Capitalism Hits Home. Again, I want to thank you. I want to ask everyone to go to www.democracyatwork.info and sign up to join so you can hear about our podcasts, so you can hear about our products, so you can have promotions, so you can have statements by the people who have these podcasts that help us understand what's going on. Please do that. And thank you to the people who are financial supporters, but also to all of you who listen. We know that not everyone has discretionary income, and we appreciate your listening, and we also appreciate your sharing our podcasts with others. Thank you so much. Goodbye for today.